Greetings and welcome to another edition of Alusine Multicultural Family Consulting. My request, as always, is to ask you to subscribe to YouTube Dr. Alusine Kanu. As always, it's another day in paradise. And I want to take this opportunity to share with you another topic that's useful in our everyday functioning and in our lifelong development. The topic for today is titled Conflict and its Resolution. When we talk of conflict, everyone has a view of what it is. I once read an article titled Man-Child in the Mainstream. Maybe that's an example of conflict. I once had a professor, after hearing my endless stories and troubles, introduce me to chaos theory. Maybe that's another view of conflict. For my master's degree, my thesis was on how you select and how you train paraprofessional counselors. So I approach conflict from a helping point of view. Conflict resolution is essential in counseling and in mental health. For my presentation today on the topic of conflict and its resolution, I'm going to start by defining conflict and talking about conflict behaviors, whether conflict is positive or negative, how cultures view conflict in relationships, ways to manage conflict, and a conflict resolution checkup, as I call it. Conflict happens, some blame it on the environment, some blame it on individual motives and desires, and some base it on need orientations and fulfillments. A good way to view conflict is from a situational context. Conflict lies in the situation, sometimes not the behavior or the lack of the behavior. There are conflicts of interest. Conflict can lead to whether people are compatible. Conflict can lead to whether people are incompatible. Sometimes in professional relationships we have what we call a dual relationship. Being a doctor, being a professor, being a counselor, how you relate in ethical ways to the client. All of those are ways we view conflict. Even though cultures are different in terms of conflict, there are cultural universals when it comes to conflict. One cultural universal is that conflict is not always destructive. The goal is to learn how to manage conflict, how to dig into the issue, how to understand the problems, how to create solutions, how to strengthen relationships that are specific to the culture or the tradition. The global world has made great progress in relations to conflict. Now we can understand one another. We can learn ways to manage conflict. We can learn that we live in an interdependent global world. From a research base, even researchers sometimes have conflict. There are the qualitative researchers and the quantitative researchers. And sometimes one doesn't want to have anything to do with the other. Some deal with words, some deal with numbers. And when it comes to conflict, sometimes there are those who try to reinvent the wheel, and they try to start from all over. So there are those who try not to upset the apple cart when it comes to conflict. But conflict arises sometimes because of fundamental values or relationships. Some say when conflict happens, it can lead to emotions. And sometimes some prescribe, some suggest. And conflict sometimes creates a get off my back reaction. And when conflict happens, it can be costly in terms of time, in terms of money, in terms of effort, in terms of emotions. So learning how to manage conflict affects dynamics and outcomes. So the way conflict resolution works is that we should learn how to coordinate efforts with one another. In some cases, we should learn how to exchange. In some cases, we should learn how to support when we make decisions. When conflict works, the team works. It leads to quality relationships. It leads to ways to develop those relationships. Conflict happens sometimes because of incompatible goals. And those incompatible goals lead to the choices we make, how we are responsible for making those choices, and how we manage conflict. A good way to view conflict from a practical point of view is that each individual is independent. I am me. But at the same time, I am interdependent. I depend on others, and they depend on me. And as a result, there is gonna be incompatibility. You're gonna like things I don't like. You're gonna do things I don't do. And those incompatibilities sometimes lead to interference. We block, or somebody blocks another. And that's what we call conflict. That's why it's good to reward people who knows how to negotiate, how to mediate, ways to resolve conflict. Now that I've defined conflict, let's look at some conflict behaviors according to the research by Bako. Bako defines several ways people behave when conflict is experienced. One is some blend ideas to create new solutions to conflict. Another is some shy away from topics that are sources of disputes. Another is some insist on their position during a conflict. Another is some try to find solutions to combine a variety of viewpoints. Another, some stay clear of disagreeable situations. Another way people view or behave when they experience conflict, some do not give in to other people's ideas. Some look for middle ground. Some minimize the significance of the conflict. Some build an integrated solution. Some stress on their point by hitting their fist on the table. Some threaten people to reach agreement. Some shout at others to get their position accepted. Some look for mutually satisfying solutions. Some keep quiet in order to avoid disagreements. So those are the views or the behaviors of people when they experience conflict, according to Bako. So I've defined what conflict is, and I've talked about some of those behaviors. Is conflict good or bad? Is conflict positive or negative? Well, let's start from the bad news. Conflict is bad because sometimes it involves in threatening others. Conflict is bad because it leads to abnormal behaviors. Conflict is bad because it can be destructive. It can be unnecessary. It can be overwhelming, undesirable, avoidable, unhealthy, and dirty. Those are reasons why, according to Gamble, why conflict is bad. They say conflict is also positive. Conflict can be good when it happens. It can be rewarding. It can be normal. It can be constructive. It can be necessary. It can be challenging. It can be desirable. It can be healthy. And it can be clean. So I've defined conflict. I've talked about behaviors, why conflict is positive and why conflict is negative. Now let's look at how cultures view conflict. And I'm going to make a comparison of cultures that are individualistic, their approaches to conflict, and cultures that are collective, their approaches to conflict. In individualistic cultures, the purpose of conflict is to hear out differences and problems. If something is wrong, talk about it. In collective cultures, sometimes conflict is damaging to self-respect or relational harmony, so avoid it. I once read a story by Chekhov called The Sneeze. This guy in a collective culture happened to sneeze on his superior. He followed him for 2 hours, apologizing why he sneezed to him and why it's the wrong thing. So sometimes in collective cultures, when conflict happens, you try to avoid it as much as possible. In individualistic cultures, we say conflict can be functional or dysfunctional. Is it gonna work out or is it not gonna work out? In collective cultures, conflict is dysfunctional. Everything else is not gonna work out because something is wrong in some cultures. In individualistic cultures, when you repress the conflict, it leads to dysfunction. In collective cultures, if you express your conflict, some view it as emotional immaturity and a lack of self-discipline. In some collective cultures, don't talk about how you feel. Conflict in individualistic cultures provides an opportunity for problem solving. In collective cultures, the primary goal is face saving. Look good, let the other person look good. Conflict in individualistic cultures, you separate the problem from the relationship when it happens. In collective cultures, if something is wrong with the relationship, in some cases everything else is intertwined to that problem. In individualistic cultures, conflict should be handled directly and openly. In collective cultures, sometimes you handle the conflict discreetly, indirectly. In individualistic cultures, the major approach to problem or conflict resolution is problem solving. Solve the problem. Create a win-win outcome. In collective cultures, the major approach sometimes is face-saving, making the other person look good. So those are orientations of conflict resolution in individualistic and cultures, collective. What causes conflict? Well, many things cause conflict. Differences in information can lead to conflict. You have this information, the other person has that information. Differences in beliefs. You believe one thing, the other person believes another. Differences in values. The pressure to avoid failure. Sometimes we're going to fail at something, we blame the person who makes the decision as to why we fail. A scarcity of resources, money, power, time, women, men can lead to conflict. sometimes trying to prove to the other person you are an equal can lead to conflict. Sometimes there is image conflict. The role I play, the status I have. Sometimes there is content conflict. What others say. Sometimes there is context conflict. Conflict based on the situation. Sometimes there is ego conflict. Sometimes there is conflict based on stereotypes, views others may have with regard to age or gender, and so on and so forth. Sometimes there is ethnocentrism, the view that cultures have that their culture is the best in the world. So conflict is not K-N-O-T-S. In other words, it's complex and it's interwoven by a number of factors. Conflicts may be sometimes in cases of ethnic, political, in-group, out-group. Conflict and culture are linked. Cultural differences sometimes doesn't inevitably produce conflict. So conflict is a normal part of human interaction. It is inevitable. Sometimes conflict can lead to segregation, discrimination, exclusion, and there are three levels of conflict. There is the lose-lose, there is the win-lose, and there is the win-win. To have a win-win includes tolerance and patience. When I teach students how to think about conflict, I ask them to think about what you may want from a situation, what the other person may perceive from the situation, to identify the point of disagreement, what happened when they confront the individual and the discussion. So conflict is inevitable. People think as though when they experience conflict, the relationship is in jeopardy. A conflict-free relationship is probably a sign that you don't have a relationship. Conflict happens in all cases, in romantic relationships, sometimes balancing the independence and the interdependence may lead to conflict. Balancing the privacy and the public may lead to conflict. How relational partners deal with intimacy, passion, commitment. In workplaces, there are also conflicts. Sometimes who is responsible for what? How the workplace is coordinated, the objectives, the resources, the leadership. With friendships, we also experience conflict when we violate rules or we disagree over ideas. So conflict can have negative and positive effects. Let's look at the negative effects of conflict. When conflict happens, sometimes we have a negative regard for the opponent. We deplete energy that we could have spent more constructively when conflict happens. When conflict happens, sometimes there are emotional issues. The positive aspects of conflict, it forces us to examine the problems. It makes us be stronger in the relationships. It leads to relationship goals. Conflict has consequences. So in the end, the way people resolve conflict, some compete. I win, you lose. Some avoid. I lose, you lose. Some accommodate. I lose, you win. Some compromise. I win and lose, and you win and lose. So, conflict is good when we advise people about conflict to talk about the idea that the best way to fight is in private, and be sure you are ready to fight and know what you're gonna fight about. So, conflict is best resolved if you also talk about the content as well as the relationship. Empathize. Put yourself in the other person's shoes. Avoid mind reading. Examine possibilities. So my conclusion on the topic of conflict is that the way I deal with conflict is that it's a cognitive process. In other words, how we view conflict in relationships is in our heads. In other words, the way we think about a relationship and what the problem is and the orientation determines how we relate to conflict. So it's good to give feedback in relationships. It's good to know that sometimes messages are one way. Sometimes messages come with feedback. Sometimes messages are transaction. So in figuring out conflict, let's examine the facts. Let's examine the emotions involved. And let's put conflict into practice. So a way to manage conflict in my parting statement, conflict resolution is based on the goals to be achieved, the emotional state, and how we think about the situation. So once again, I thank you for your time, for your efforts, and for listening to my views about conflict